Imagine being just 12 years old, lost on the streets with no family, no home, and no hope. What would you do if one moment of kindness changed everything? This story will take you on a journey of courage, compassion, and the power of second chances. Watch until the end to see how one boy's life takes an unexpected turn. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Joshua, a 12-year-old boy, sat on a cold park bench, pulling his thin jacket tighter around him as the evening chill crept in. Life on the streets had become his reality ever since his father, a hard-working warehouse employee, was wrongfully convicted of theft. The accusations were baseless, driven by racial prejudice, but the judge dismissed all evidence in his favor. Without any family to turn to, Joshua found himself homeless, navigating the harsh streets of the city on his own. He scavenged for food in dumpsters behind restaurants, endured harsh weather with only the clothes on his back, and slept in parks or abandoned buildings. Each day was a struggle for survival, but Joshua held on to faint memories of his father's words about perseverance and hope, even in the face of injustice. It was these memories that kept him moving forward, even as hunger gnawed at his stomach and loneliness settled deep in his chest. One evening, Joshua wandered into a quiet, affluent neighborhood. The contrast between his torn clothes and the immaculate lawns and towering mansions was stark. He paused at the gates of an impressive estate, captivated by its grandeur. Through the wrought iron bars, he could see the sprawling garden, fountains glimmering in the fading sunlight, and a long driveway that led to a grand house with large, glowing windows. For a moment, he imagined what it might be like to live in such a place, with warmth, food, and a sense of safety. Lost in thought, Joshua didn't notice the sleek black car pulling into the driveway until its headlights illuminated him. Startled, he stepped back, clutching his frayed backpack to his chest. The car stopped, and a man and woman stepped out. The man, tall and sharply dressed, frowned as his eyes fell on Joshua. "What are you doing here?" the man snapped, his voice cold and dismissive. "This is private property. Get lost." Joshua flinched at the harshness of the words, but didn't respond, lowering his gaze to the ground. He'd grown used to being treated this way, yet each time it stung just as much. He turned to leave when the woman's voice cut through the air. "Wait," she said, her tone soft but firm. She placed a gentle hand on the man's arm, stopping him. "Don't speak to him like that, Tom. He's just a child." Tom huffed in annoyance, but the woman ignored him and approached Joshua. She knelt down to his level, her kind eyes meeting his. "What's your name?" she asked with a warm smile. Joshua hesitated, unsure if he should answer. Finally, he murmured, "Joshua." "Joshua," she repeated. "Are you okay? Do you have somewhere to stay?" He shook his head, his voice barely audible as he said, "No, ma'am." The woman's expression softened even more. "Are you hungry?" Joshua nodded reluctantly. He hated admitting his need, but the hunger pains in his stomach were too strong to ignore. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a few crisp bills. "Here," she said, offering him the money. "Buy yourself something to eat." Joshua stared at the money in disbelief before hesitantly taking it. "Thank you, ma'am," he whispered. The woman smiled again. "My name is Emily. Tomorrow my husband and I are getting married here," she said, gesturing toward the house. "If you're around, you're welcome to join us." Joshua blinked in surprise. No one had ever invited him to something so grand before. He shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am, I can't." "Of course you can," Emily insisted gently. "There will be plenty of food, and I'd love for you to be there." Emily, this is ridiculous, Tom interrupted, his irritation clear. You can't just invite strangers to our wedding. Emily turned to him with a sharp look. He's not a stranger, Tom. He's a child in need. Have a little compassion. Tom muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. Emily turned back to Joshua, her expression softening again. I hope you'll come, she said before standing. Take care of yourself, Joshua. Joshua clutched the money tightly in his hand and nodded. Thank you, he said again. He watched as the couple walked up the driveway, Emily's voice carrying in the air as she gently scolded Tom for his behavior. As the gates closed behind them, Joshua stood there for a moment longer, staring at the house. He felt a flicker of warmth in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time, but he knew better than to hope for too much. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the city as the night fell. The next day, Joshua found himself wandering through the city once more, the crumpled bills Emily had given him safely tucked into his pocket. He had bought a sandwich that morning, savoring every bite as if it were a feast. It had been a long time since he'd eaten something fresh, and he felt a rare sense of gratitude. Yet, as the hours passed, his thoughts kept returning to the kind woman who had stopped to talk to him. Emily's warmth and invitation had stayed with him, though he hadn't dared to take her up on it. He wasn't sure he belonged in a place like that, surrounded by people who would likely look at him the same way her husband Tom had. As the sun began to set, Joshua's wandering brought him back to the same neighborhood. He didn't know why his feet had carried him there, but soon he was standing near the gates of the grand estate once more. The wedding was in full swing. Music and laughter echoed from the garden, and the faint aroma of food wafted through the air. From his vantage point on the street, he could see glimpses of the celebration. Strings of lights twinkling in the trees, guests dressed in fine clothes, and servers moving gracefully through the crowd with trays of drinks and hors d'oeuvres. For a brief moment, Joshua imagined what it might feel like to be part of something so joyous and beautiful. He stayed in the shadows, not wanting to be seen. Even if Emily had been sincere in her invitation, he couldn't shake the fear of Tom's scornful gaze or the judgment of the other guests. Joshua turned to leave, but then something caught his attention. A loud commotion erupted near the house, followed by a cry of alarm. He stopped in his tracks and looked back. Flames were licking up the side of the grand mansion, their orange glow cutting through the twilight. Smoke began to billow into the sky, and the festive sounds of the wedding turned into screams of panic. Guests started running from the garden toward the front gates, their faces pale with fear. Joshua watched as people stumbled over one another, desperate to get to safety. His heart pounded as he saw Emily and Tom among the crowd. Emily looked frantic, her head whipping from side to side as if searching for someone. Tom grabbed her arm, shouting something Joshua couldn't hear over the chaos. The sound of sirens grew closer, and within minutes, fire trucks pulled up to the scene. Firefighters jumped out, quickly assessing the situation and pulling hoses to the front of the house. Joshua stepped closer, unnoticed amidst the confusion. His eyes were fixed on the flames, which were spreading rapidly, consuming the upper floors of the mansion. Then he heard Tom's voice, sharp and desperate. "She's still in there, my wife. She's still inside." Joshua's stomach dropped as he realized Emily wasn't among the fleeing guests. She must have gone back into the house for some reason. Tom was shouting at the firefighters, his face twisted in panic. "You have to get her out. She's upstairs." One of the firefighters shook his head. "The main entrance is blocked and the stairs are unstable. We can't send anyone in until we secure the structure." Tom looked as though he was about to collapse. He grabbed the firefighter by the front of his jacket, his voice breaking. "Please, you have to save her." "We're doing everything we can," the firefighter said firmly, pulling away. "But it's not safe to go in right now." Joshua's mind raced. He could hear the crackling of the fire, see the orange glow illuminating the faces of the frightened crowd, and feel the heat radiating from the burning house even from where he stood. His thoughts turned to Emily, the only person who had shown him kindness in a long time. She had stopped when no one else did. She had given him food and treated him like a human being when everyone else looked at him with disdain. Without thinking, Joshua moved closer to the house. The firefighters were focused on their equipment, and the crowd was too preoccupied with the fire to notice him slipping through the gates. He spotted a small window near the back of the house, its glass already cracked from the heat. He hesitated for only a moment before climbing through, ignoring the shouts of someone who had finally seen him. Inside, the heat was overwhelming, and smoke filled the air, stinging his eyes and making it hard to breathe. Joshua pulled his shirt up over his mouth and nose, trying to filter the smoke as he navigated the chaotic interior. The walls were scorched black, and the sound of wood creaking and collapsing echoed around him. He called out for Emily, his voice hoarse. "Ma'am, Emily." He pushed through the thick haze, searching every room he could. Just as he was about to lose hope, he saw her. She was lying on the floor in a small sitting room, surrounded by flames that were creeping closer. Joshua rushed to her side, coughing violently as he tried to lift her. She was unconscious, her face pale but her chest rising and falling faintly. "Wake up," he cried, shaking her gently, but she didn't stir. He knew he didn't have much time. Gathering all his strength, he hoisted her onto his shoulders. The weight was almost too much for his small frame, but he didn't stop. Emily had shown him kindness when no one else had. He wouldn't let her die. Through sheer determination, Joshua retraced his steps, heading back to the window he had entered. The smoke was thicker now, and flames licked at the walls on either side of him. He could barely see, his lungs burning with every breath, but he kept moving. When he reached the window, he shifted Emily's weight and carefully pushed her through, where waiting hands pulled her to safety. Joshua tried to climb out after her, but the effort had drained him completely. As he reached for the edge of the window, his vision blurred, and the world around him faded into darkness. Joshua's consciousness returned slowly, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling his nose. The world around him was blurry at first, but as his vision cleared, he saw the white ceiling of a hospital room. His body ached, every muscle screaming in protest as he tried to shift slightly on the bed. His throat burned, his lungs felt raw, and his skin was tender where it had been scorched by the fire. A faint beeping sound accompanied the steady rhythm of his heart monitor, and he realized he was connected to various machines. As his awareness grew, so did his confusion. He remembered the fire, the overwhelming heat, and the smoke that had choked him as he carried Emily out of the burning mansion. The last thing he recalled was the window and the desperate push to get her to safety. He didn't remember how he had gotten out or how he had ended up in the hospital. The sound of a door opening caught his attention, and he turned his head with great effort. Emily stood in the doorway, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. She hurried to his side, her elegant dress from the wedding replaced with a simple sweater and jeans. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she reached out to take his hand. "Joshua," she said softly, her voice trembling, "you're awake. Thank God." He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, and only a raspy sound escaped. Emily quickly poured a glass of water from a pitcher on the bedside table and helped him drink. The cool liquid soothed the burning in his throat, and after a moment, he managed a weak whisper. "Did you make it out?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Emily's tears spilled over, and she nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. "Yes, Joshua, you saved me. You saved my life." Her words brought a faint sense of relief, but Joshua's mind was still clouded with questions. Before he could ask anything more, another figure entered the room. It was Tom. His usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced by an expression of guilt and remorse. He stood at the foot of the bed, looking at Joshua with a mixture of hesitation and shame. "Joshua," Tom began, his voice unsteady. "I don't even know where to start. He paused, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I owe you an apology. A huge one." Joshua's tired eyes shifted to Tom, confusion evident on his face. Tom took a deep breath and stepped closer. "I was wrong," he continued, his voice growing firmer. "About you, about everything. When I saw you near the house that day, I judged you without knowing anything about you. I was cruel and unfair, and I've been carrying that guilt ever since. But what you did, risking your life to save Emily, you've shown me how blind I've been." Emily nodded in agreement, her hand still gripping Joshua's. "Tom has been struggling to find the right words, but he means every one of them," she said gently. "You've changed both of us." Tom took another step forward. "Joshua, I've lived my whole life surrounded by people who taught me to think the way I did, to look down on others, to judge them for things they can't control. But you've shown me that none of that matters. What matters is the kind of person you are, and you are braver and kinder than anyone I've ever met." Joshua didn't know how to respond. He was overwhelmed by the weight of their words and the sincerity in their voices. He looked down at his hands, unsure of what to say. Emily's voice broke the silence. "We've been talking, Tom and I," she said softly. "Joshua, we know you don't have a home, and we want to change that. We want you to come live with us, to be part of our family." Joshua's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "You want to adopt me?" he asked, his voice shaky. Emily nodded, her expression full of hope. "Yes, if you'll let us. We don't have children of our own, and we've always wanted a family. You've already shown us that you're part of ours in every way that matters." Tom stepped closer, his eyes earnest. "I know I've made mistakes, Joshua, but I want to make things right. I want to give you the home and the family you deserve." Joshua felt tears welling up in his own eyes. He thought about the months he had spent alone, the nights he had shivered in the cold, the days he had gone hungry. He thought about his father and the injustice that had torn their family apart. And now, here were these people, strangers who'd become something more, offering him a new chance at life. He began, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Emily said gently, hopeful smile spreading across her face. "We'd be honored to have you." Joshua looked at her, then at Tom, and finally nodded. "Yes," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that." Emily let out a soft cry of relief and leaned down to hug him, careful not to hurt him. Tom placed a hand on Joshua's shoulder, a small but sincere gesture of acceptance. For the first time in what felt like forever, Joshua felt a flicker of hope that his life could be different, that it could be better. As they sat together in the hospital room, Joshua realized that the kindness Emily had shown him that day by the gate had set something in motion. It had led him here, to this moment, and to a future he hadn't dared to dream of before. Years passed, and the memory of that fateful day never left Joshua. Now, a young man in his 20s, he stood tall and proud, wearing the uniform of a firefighter. His journey to this point had been long and challenging, but it was a path he had chosen with conviction. Every step of the way, he had been supported by Emily and Tom, who had become not only his adoptive parents, but also his greatest champions. Their unwavering belief in him had helped him heal from the wounds of his past and find purpose in his life. Joshua's decision to become a firefighter was driven by the events of that night. He couldn't forget the terror of the flames, the suffocating smoke, or the desperation he had felt as he carried Emily out of the burning mansion. But more than that, he couldn't forget the impact of kindness, the way Emily had shown him compassion when no one else had. He wanted to be the kind of person who could make a difference, just as she had for him. One crisp autumn morning, Joshua found himself standing in front of a familiar building. It was the firehouse where he had recently been assigned, a bustling hub of activity filled with the sound of alarms, radios, and the chatter of his new colleagues. He had worked hard to earn his place here, studying tirelessly, training his body to endure the physical demands of the job, and learning everything he could about firefighting. Now, as he walked through the doors, he felt a sense of pride and belonging that he hadn't felt since his father's wrongful imprisonment. The team welcomed him warmly, and Joshua quickly earned their respect with his dedication and courage. He threw himself into the work, responding to calls with unwavering determination and using his first-hand experience to connect with people in crisis. Each rescue was a reminder of why he had chosen this path, and he approached every situation with empathy and resolve. One day, while returning from a call, Joshua's thoughts drifted back to Emily and Tom. They had been there for every milestone: his high school graduation, his acceptance into the firefighter academy, and his first day on the job. Tom had become a different man over the years, shedding the prejudices that had once clouded his judgment and embracing Joshua as his son. Their bond had grown strong, and they often spent hours talking about life, family, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Emily remained the heart of their family, her kindness and warmth a constant source of comfort and inspiration. After his shift, Joshua decided to visit them. Driving up to the house, he couldn't help but smile at the sight of the familiar gates. The mansion had been rebuilt after the fire, but it was the people inside who made it feel like home. As he entered, Emily greeted him with a hug, her face lighting up with joy. "Joshua, it's so good to see you," she said, leading him into the living room where Tom was waiting. The three of them sat together, talking and laughing as they caught up on each other's lives. For Joshua, these moments were a reminder of how far they had all come. Later that evening, as he prepared to leave, Joshua paused at the door. He turned to Emily and Tom, his voice filled with gratitude. "I just want to say thank you," he said, "for everything, for believing in me, for giving me a home, for teaching me what it means to be part of a family." Emily's eyes glistened with tears, and she reached out to take his hand. "You've given us just as much, Joshua. You've shown us the strength of forgiveness, the power of kindness, and the importance of love. We're so proud of you." Tom nodded, his expression solemn but full of pride. "You've become an incredible man, Joshua. Your father would be proud of you, too." The mention of his father brought a lump to Joshua's throat, but it was a bittersweet feeling. He still missed his father deeply, but he knew he was honoring his memory by living a life of purpose and integrity. As he drove away that night, he reflected on how much his life had changed. From a scared, hungry boy on the streets to a firefighter dedicated to saving lives, his journey had been shaped by the kindness of one woman and the courage he had found within himself. In the years to come, Joshua continued to make a difference in the lives of others. His story inspired his colleagues, his community, and even strangers who heard about the boy who had risked everything to save someone who had shown him compassion. And though he never forgot the pain and hardship of his past, he used it as a source of strength, reminding himself that even in the darkest moments, there is always a spark of hope waiting to ignite. Every act of kindness can spark a chain of miracles. What did you think of this powerful journey? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know how you'd act in such a situation. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep these inspiring stories alive.